Hi, I'm Scott.
And I'm Jamie.
And welcome to God or Not, the podcast where truth springs from argument among friends. This is episode number 5. And coming up, Jamie and I will be talking about extraordinary evidence. Also in this episode, spin the wheel and the crowd goes wild. So grab your popcorn, sit back, and enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the center ring. This is the God or Not podcast. We're in for a great night of civil discourse here as these two warriors are revved up and ready to go. And now, let's get ready to dialogue!
So here we are with episode number 5, and the things have been going fairly smoothly. I think we've been, we've had a good start to the podcast, and I'm excited. The discussions that we've had so far, I'm looking forward to some of the new stuff, some of the new areas we're going to be venturing out into.
Yes, all kinds of weeds.
Right. We're weed hunters. Is that it?
Yeah.
Well, in this episode, we're going to introduce a new item that we're going to be doing, and it's called The Crowd Goes Wild. And basically what this is going to be is all kinds of listener feedback related stuff, right? And so for this first one, we're going to be addressing an email that we received, and let's just dive into that in The Crowd Goes Wild.
And the crowd goes wild.
This is our first installment of The Crowd Goes Wild. Well, this is, so the mail is starting to come in. And this particular letter was from a listener, and he had a few things to say about the show. It was actually a very interesting letter. It was nice to receive. And he brought up several points, and one of them had to do with when Jamie and I were talking about morality, and I posed a question, Jamie, to you. I asked you, what if God told you that you should murder somebody? Or I can't remember exactly how I said it, but what if God told you murdering was okay?
Right.
And you said you couldn't answer, and the reason that you said you couldn't was because it's part of God's nature to be good, and so God can't do that. And so you're kind of posing it as my question was already self-contradicting.
It's like a false dilemma,
something along those lines, right? And so he brought up that point, but the reason that he brought it up was in reference to something that I had said. That I said after that, and that is that, well, what if you're wrong about God's nature?
What if I'm wrong?
Right? And so you were basing your decision. You thought it would be impossible for God to say that because of God's nature. And then I said, well, what if you were wrong about God's nature? And then, what are your thoughts then after reading his letter here?
I think that God presents himself, at least the Christian God, the Bible, he presents himself, and we could know what his nature is through 3 ways: through our conscience, through revelation, namely the Bible, and then through reason and logic, through philosophy, namely. So basically, our conscience, we all have this, and both you and I agree that we have these faculties where we do think that certain things are objectively right or objectively wrong. And so I think that's part of our conscience. It's built into us. So I think God has given us a kind of innate sense of what is right and wrong. So I think we could know God's nature based upon that, as long as our faculties are working normally. And then also in the Bible, I think God gives us a clear representation of who he is. But I think the way I think that we could know is primarily through philosophy. So through logic, we call God a maximally great being. And in this kind of maximally great being theology, God, the idea of God is this thing that is worthy of our worship. and in maximally great being kind of understanding, God wouldn't be worthy of worship unless he's perfectly good, unless he is the locus of what is good and what is perfect. And so, and then we would know that if God is good and perfect and he created us and gave us this innate sense of right and wrong, this conscience, that we would know that murder would be wrong. And he had brought up talking about killing, or specifically talking about, well, God can command people to murder. I wouldn't say that. I would say maybe God could command people to kill. But if God is the author of life, then he can take life whenever he wants to. And we also have to remember that if God is real, if God is real,
yeah.
And so we're making the understanding of the claim that God is real. If God is real and he created life, he can take it whenever he wants. He's God.
Oh no.
If he's real. I'm not
I heard that part.
Right, okay.
Well, I still disagree with you.
So if you create something, Scott, you don't have the right to destroy it whenever you want. Like you build a Lego.
If it's a person.
Sure you do. You guys do it all the time. It's called abortion.
Oh,
was that out of line?
Anyhow. That's not a person. That's not a person.
Oh, okay. That's for another discussion. Didn't we already have that? Was that episode 3?
All right. We've gone off the rails here. Anyhow,
so okay. I would say that we can know God's nature. That we can know God's nature within a certain sense of certainty. So I'm not saying there would never be gray area. Okay, but I'm saying within the big things, within those things that we could agree on that are objectively right and wrong, I think that it makes sense to say through either conscience or through revelation of the Bible or through philosophy that we can know what would a maximally great being, what would this God look like if there was something worthy of worship?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, have you ever watched a cartoon, like an older cartoon where there's like the wolf and he's looking at like Porky Pig or something, and Porky Pig turns into a big steak and the wolf just starts drooling and
that's
drooling.
Where you're at right now.
I'm just listening to you. I'm like, oh, there's just so much red meat in what you just said.
But we can't go any further, can we?
We're stuck in the constraints of this little segment. So maybe this will be a teaser for an up and coming episode where we take a deeper dive into this.
Into why Jamie's wrong
again. Oh boy, that could be the whole podcast right there.
Yeah, we should.
All right, but for now, we're going to have to wrap up this segment. And so that's
thank you, David.
Thank
you, David, for your email.
And there we are. Yeah. That's our first listener feedback segment. And so for all you listeners out there, if you're listening to this, you're a God or Not listener. If you have any questions or comments, definitely drop us a line. Yeah, send us an email at godornotpodcast.com. And we do try to read and respond to as much of the email as we can.
The more extraordinary the email or the claim, the greater chance you will have of us reading it on the air.
Exactly. Also, if you we won't use your name on the air unless you want us to. And so if you want to let us use your name, mention that in the email. But speaking of extraordinary, Jamie, with the super smooth segue there.
Thank you.
Extraordinary evidence.
Thank you very much.
That's what our main talk here is going to be today. And I should point out, though, that this is actually 2 discussions that we had at 2 different times, and we kind of melded them together.
18 hours and 14 sit-downs later.
Exactly.
We blended together all 85 hours of our back and forth into a much more bite-sized bit. For those of you who don't know, we actually record so much hits the cutting room floor because we want to put out some substantial podcasts, but then it can't be 5 and 6 hours long. Although you and I would probably be okay with that, but we may not get as many listeners. So we have
kind of like this segue is about 5 or 6 hours long. Is that right?
Real nice.
Okay. Let's just dive into it. Let's talk about extraordinary evidence.
This is the main event.
Jamie, today we're going to be exploring I don't know if you'd call it a saying or or something. It's the phrase or the sentence, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's usually credited to Carl Sagan from his show The Cosmos in in the 1980s, around there, and it's often called the Sagan Standard. But this idea has popped up before Sagan. For example, Pierre-Simon Laplace. I'm sure I totally butchered his name. He was a French mathematician. Did it? Did it sound good?
It sounded
I was convincing enough. All right. Well, he was a French philosopher and mathematician, and back in those days, people kind of did everything. You weren't just a mathematician or weren't just a biologist. You kind of did all of it.
Everyone was a philosopher too.
Right, pretty much. Yeah.
Right.
But he said the weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportioned to its strangeness. And I'm assuming that it sounded much better when he said it in French,
or with a really thick French English with a really thick French accent.
That could be. I'll try to avoid doing that. I think that would be too painful to listen to. But also slightly more recently, Thomas Jefferson said, where facts are suggested, bearing no analogy with the laws of nature as yet known to us, their verity needs proofs proportioned to their difficulty. And then, of course, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who penned our phrase from our opening, from our intro, the truth. What was it? Truth
springs.
Truth springs from argument among friends. But he said a wise man apportions his belief to the evidence.
I actually found of those three, that one. I think the best. I think that is the most accurate of the three that we just went over here.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, his is a little bit more general, and it applies to all kinds of evidence or all kinds of claims, whether they're extraordinary or common. And so we need to look at the evidence that's available, and then we need to apportion our belief in those claims based on the quality of it.
It seems that last one by Hume is that any claim, whether they seem extraordinary or not, only requires sufficient evidence. Now, you could say, well, the sufficient evidence and extraordinary evidence can be defined kind of the same way. But basically, the amount of proof or evidence needed to establish a fact only needs to be sufficient to warrant belief in it. So anyhow, I just thought that was the most accurate of the three.
Sure.
Why don't you give us some examples, like some everyday examples?
Sure. Hey, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Why don't I do that? So just to give an example, try to kind of separate what we're talking about here. So let's say that you live like 20 miles from my house. So I know I actually did I looked it up on Google Maps. We're about 750 miles apart.
Wow.
About 750. Okay. And I know it seems like you're right here in the room with me. But let's say we live to say 20-ish miles apart, or something relatively close like that. And so let's say I just show up at your house one day, and you say, "Hey, what's going on?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I drove over here." Okay, and so that's a fairly common, a mundane claim, and so it wouldn't take much for me to convince you that I drove over.
Right.
Okay, so now let's compare that then to say that I walked over. And so we're talking 20 miles. It's, doable. It's doable, but it's not you don't often do it. Or at least I don't very often do a 20-mile walk of at one stretch.
No.
And so that would require, maybe you'd notice that, maybe I'm wearing uncomfortable shoes or maybe I'm not sweating or something like that. And, it might take a little bit more convincing than the fact that I drove over. And so then let's compare that. We'll kick it up a notch here. Let's say that I flew a helicopter over. Okay, so now you're starting to get suspicious. And again, it's going to take a little bit more evidence. If I pull out my wallet and I show you my pilot's license,
right?
That would lend a little more credibility. Or if you remember, oh yeah, I was wondering what that racket was outside. Or things like that. So it would require a little bit more than me just telling you and then you believing.
Or if you call me ahead of time and said, "Hey, Jeremy, set up a landing zone.
I need you to set up a landing zone for me in your backyard.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you imagine me doing that? Me calling you up and saying that?
No, probably not. But that would be good evidence.
Yeah. So the point is, though, it would take a little bit more convincing than for me to tell you, that for you to believe that I drove over or walked over. And so then let's kick it up another notch here. So then let's say, instead of that, let's say I told you that I did fly over, but I did it. I walked outside my house. I started flapping my arms and I flew like a bird over to your house. Okay, so now you're going to start, thinking, okay, let's hide the sharp objects, and let's maybe we should call that ambulance over or something.
He needs to go to the psych ward.
Right now, although technically that might be possible. I've seen devices where you can kind of flap and so forth, and there's at least other animals that can do this. Right. There are, it's not a physical impossibility, although ridiculously unlikely. And so it would probably take a lot for me. I'd probably have to demonstrate to you that I could do it for you to believe me. It might be
like physically impossible, but not metaphysically impossible. And I think the difference for our listeners would be like, physically, we're not equipped to fly. We just can't fly.
Right.
But
Right.
Metaphysically, like, it's not logically impossible. It's not a contradiction.
It doesn't violate.
Right.
Exactly.
So,
right.
No,
okay.
I would need quite a bit of convincing, though, if you said you flew with a bird. Yeah.
Exactly. And so then if we go up another notch there and we say, if I claimed I opened up this wormhole portal in space and I just walked through it and it transported me here. Okay. So now we're going beyond physical impossibility, and we're looking at, okay, so this is, it would be something unheard of in all of history for anything. And so I don't know. I don't know if I could even convince you at all that that's even if you saw it, you probably, I don't know if you believe it. So it'd be, and then finally, my last example is I can say, what are you talking about? I've always been here. I've been here for the last week.
Right.
And so that not only is that like really stretching believability, but
there's
you actually have evidence
against it. Right. Yep.
Exactly. Yep. So it's like against the available evidence. So you can see like each of these levels, each of these examples kind of ratchets up and the believability, and so would then require more extreme evidence for you to, it would be very, very, I'd probably have to convince you that you were in a coma or something like that for me to get you to believe that I had been there the whole time. Maybe if, I suppose if I had like a doctor, declare you delusional, some kind of, you were having hallucinations, maybe, I don't know. That's pretty hard. But anyway, so those are the kind of the ideas. And as we're talking about it tonight, we can kind of refer back to those different levels of, ideas, those different levels of believability. But I thought we could, now that we got that kind of set up, maybe we can talk about, well, what are we talking about when we mean evidence? What would be a good definition of evidence? And my favorite, and I'm going to ask you in a second, what you like for, what evidence means to you. But a couple of years ago, I used to listen to a podcast called Rationally Speaking, and there was a host. One of the hosts on there was a former biologist and now a philosopher of science named by the name of Massimo Pigliucci. And
man, you and the big names today, buddy. You're trying to impress somebody here.
Right. They every once in a while they would have like you could email them questions and they would answer the questions. And so I just said, well, what do you think? What would you call evidence? How would you define the word evidence? And he said that it's a fact that renders a conclusion to be more likely true than not. And so, in other words, it's some kind of fact. So it might be an observation. It might be some kind of argument or some kind of logical progression or deduction that would, in light of that particular fact, it would, some particular conclusion might be considered more likely to be true than it is false. And so, I've always kind of attached myself to that kind of definition. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's
what comes to your mind.
I think it's a bad definition of evidence, but I think that it's probably important.
Wait, you think it's a bad definition?
Yeah. I think it's important though to make the distinction between evidence for and evidence. Right. So, evidence for something. That definition might work out well, but I mean, when I think of evidence, I'm thinking of court of law, and I'm thinking of evidence could be either good or bad. There's a scale, it's like everybody could bring evidence, and anything could be, brought in as Exhibit A. It doesn't matter if it's good, bad. Indifferent. The defense could bring something that is just that most people think is absolutely horrible. Like, this doesn't prove a darn thing, but it's still considered evidence nonetheless. So I think if we painted a broad brush for evidence, I think that would be a bad definition for it, because you know what I'm saying.
Okay.
So, but if you wanted to say that this is evidence for something specific, I think that maybe that's closer then to the truth, that definition for evidence for something versus simply just something being evidence. Like I said, because you could bring forward something that is pitiful and horrible, but it's still obviously, like in a court of law, considered, exhibit whatever.
Right.
That makes sense.
So you're saying that it's something that maybe is presented or something that is brought into the argument, and then what we need to do is look at it and decide whether or not it's evidence in favor of the conclusion or not.
Right. And that's why a lot of times.
So you're including things that would be considered evidence that does not favor the conclusion.
Yeah. Again, that would be all that's subjective, right? So and I guess that. And that's why we have. Well,
not necessarily. There could be statistical, backing, or there could be some kind of, some kind of physical law or something, some kind of physical.
Yeah, I suppose
property
that
could be brought into play. So it's not necessarily.
But I think most evidence that is brought, and I obviously bring up a court of law because I think when we think of the word evidence, a lot of times that's what we think of, and that's where you see it used primarily. So when you think of evidence, that's the only reason why I use court that's what I think of, and that's I think where evidence is most commonly used. So I think that most evidence that's brought in is subjective. I think that you could probably get a good consensus, like, oh yeah, the DNA for this particular thing, that's good evidence, like that's weighty, that would benefit or my defendant or hurt my defendant in a way, whereas something else, that's almost seems irrelevant. Why did they bring that forth as evidence? So yeah, I might be like splitting hairs here. But I think that too. Well,
I think it's just a semantic thing.
It might be. I
think it's just semantics.
Because when we're talking about evidence, a lot of times I hear the claim, "Oh, you guys don't have a shred of evidence for God," and I'm like, okay, that's just ridiculous, because I see evidence as anything brought forward, to help the case, or anything that either the prosecution or the defense brings forward to try to help the case. Now you get to say, well, all your evidence is horrible. Your evidence is bad. And in that case, we could determine that. But when we think of evidence and we think of it as painting that broad brush, I like to think of it as either like direct evidence or indirect evidence. So direct evidence being eyewitness. So I found this in the Collins Dictionary of Law, that there's two types of evidences: direct evidence, which is evidence in the form of testimony from a witness who actually saw, heard, or touched the subject in question. And then there's indirect evidence, which is evidence in a trial that is not directly from an eyewitness or a participant. So that is what I found as far as the types of evidence and their definitions.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like you were saying that you don't think that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is that the case, or what's the deal there?
And I think that it might just be wordplay. So of course that it comes down to what do you mean by extraordinaries? But I would say that first, the use of the word like extraordinary in this kind of presupposes that this evidence is somehow different. It's going to be different than others. It's inferring that the evidence is going to be like ontologically different than other kinds of evidence. So I think that almost a better phrase would be that any claim, whether they're extraordinary or not, only requires sufficient evidence. So the amount of proof or evidence needed to establish a fact only needs to be sufficient to warrant belief in it. So I think...
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
By sufficient, like adequate or enough. So I think just by using the word extraordinary, we're already somehow presupposing or inferring that this kind of evidence is somehow going to be different. And I mean,
like qualitatively different.
I wouldn't say qualitatively. I'd say ontologically different. So I think that evidence can come and you could evaluate the evidence and say, is there a lot of evidence? Quantity. Mm-hmm. Is the evidence that we have good? Quality. And so I think that those are the kind of the two prongs that, as far as evaluating, evidence, is there enough of it, and is it good? But when we talk about extraordinary evidence, it almost sounds or presupposes that there's something completely, wholly different. Like that this is some kind of special, some kind of glowing evidence over here that isn't. So if I was going to put a definition to extraordinary, in this kind of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, I would say that extraordinary evidence would be one in which there was quantitatively and qualitatively maybe more evidence than other claims. But I think even the better definition is just that any claim only requires sufficient evidence.
Right, but I agree with that. But I think that when we say extraordinary claims require extraordinary, extraordinary just basically refers to not ordinary, right? And so evidence could be, as you describe it, ontologically different. For example, some sort of miraculous evidence or something along those lines, something different than, say, more mundane evidence. But we also talked about how extraordinary could also talk about quantity, like the Big Bang. We said, there's not magical, ESP evidence or clairvoyant evidence about the Big Bang or anything like that. But it's just, massive amounts of, people looking up at the sky and writing something down kind of thing. Right. And so, I can see. I think I get what you're saying. Is that you're concerned about having an implied expectation of. Well, you said it specifically. You said, am I expected to perform a miracle here to prove to you that miracles can happen? Mm-hmm. And I would say, well, we're not approaching it by making any assumptions about the nature of what's going on. In fact, in many cases, we're trying to discover the nature of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so really what we're talking about is when we're talking about extraordinary, we're just really meaning out of the ordinary. So, for an example, we talked about how, let's say that you live 20 miles from my house. And if I show up and say that I drove there, you'd be like, oh, okay, well, whatever. And if I showed up and said that I flew a helicopter there, you might be a little more surprised. Or if I told you I flapped my wings and got there, then you'd expect a little. You wouldn't believe me, basically. And so I guess what I would put it to you in a question like this: if two of me walked in, two duplicates of me. And the reason that I'm using that is because I don't want there to be any other differences between the two people. So we want to have a controlled question here where there's no difference between the two people other than what they say to you when they walk in. So two copies of me walk in. One of them says, I drove here. One of them says, I flapped my arms and flew here. Now, are you more likely to believe the first one than the second one?
Sure, absolutely.
And why would you say that?
Well, because the first one is something that is common and it's everyday. It's ordinary, something that I see all the time.
Okay.
But the thing is I think where we're going with it as far as is at that point, if I'm trying to decide, like, so Scott number one, who said he drove there or whatever, he's out of the question now. I don't even have to worry about him because I believe him. I believe he drove here. Scott number two, he said he flapped his arms and flew there. The kind of evidence that I'm going to want, I think, would be I would want more evidence than just him saying that he flapped his arms. Right. I'm not asking for some wholly different kind of strange or nuanced kind of. I mean, I'm going to be expecting, if you say you flew here by just your arms, well, I'm going to want some more evidence. So that's why we're talking about quality and quantity. I think that when you talk about extraordinary, okay, if you want to say extraordinary just means you need more evidence and the evidence has to be a greater quality as far as it is implying that what you're saying is true, then I would say that's fine. But why just couldn't we then just say, if in order for me to believe that you flapped your arms to get here, I would have to have sufficient evidence that you did that.
Right.
Rather than saying extraordinary, I would just say I would have to have sufficient evidence to warrant belief in that.
Right, but if you understand that when I say extraordinary, I just mean not ordinary. So like if I walked in and I said that I drove here, you'd be like, oh, okay. Come on in, have a cup of coffee or whatever. Or if I said I walked there, it'd be kind of similar. Or if I said maybe I took a taxi or something, there's a variety of, they're all kind of ordinary things, and maybe my word would be enough. Maybe using the arm flapping was going a little too far. Maybe if I step it back a little bit and say I flew a helicopter there, that's a relatively still a mundane thing. I mean, that's still not like, pixie dust and that kind of stuff. That's still something that, in theory, I could at least do. Right. But you'd still probably expect more evidence. Is that right? Or you'd say, show me the helicopter.
More evidence, but I don't think it's extraordinary in terms of not ordinary. Yep. I mean, I still think you would show me ordinary things, but quantitatively and qualitatively, it would probably have to be more than just your word.
Right.
Does that make sense? Because I
think we're
so like I said at the beginning of this, I think that you and I both are at that same point. I don't like that using that extraordinary claims because of what is attached to it and what I've had to deal with in the past, as far as not you, but others attaching this idea that basically you're telling me that a miracle happened. And when I say I need extraordinary evidence, basically I'm asking you for a miracle to prove the miracle, which of course I won't believe that either. And so all I'm trying to do is just level the playing field so that, okay, if you say that if I'm giving you something that is crazy like that, boy, that seems pretty unlikely, then of course I would expect the evidence to be stronger. That there would either be more evidence or the quality of evidence would be greater in order for people to believe it. That makes complete sense to me. I guess it's just the attachment of what that means, in kind of the internet infidel kind of world.
Okay. That's fine. I think I would agree with what you said. I haven't been a party to any of these other discussions you've had with other people, so I can't really, I can't comment on what they meant, but I would I wouldn't be surprised if many of them meant extraordinary in the same way that I'm using it here, and just meaning so extraordinary evidence could be a miracle right in front of your face, or it could also be a larger amount of more mundane type of evidence, or it could be, multiple different sources of evidence, or, it could just something beyond, something that you wouldn't expect for a similar type of claim that was a little more common. Mm-hmm. And I think, actually, I think we're on the same page there. I'm kind of
holy. Time mark that.
Yeah,
time mark that, and let's call it quits, down. Dude. That would be perfect.
Mic drop.
And see, listen, for us, I think you and I know this already, but also for our listeners, note that this took Scott and I probably in upwards of maybe 2 or 3 hours of dialoguing, not online, but face to face, as far as, mic to mic here, actually talking in real time, probably in upwards of 3 hours for us to come to an agreement that we essentially more or less kind of mean the same thing.
Right.
That is hard. That's hard work there. And that was just, it wasn't that we disagreed with each other. That was coming to the understanding that we both, in a roundabout way, have the same idea of what we mean by that extraordinary evidence, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So that's just to say that this kind of thing, communication, is hard work.
It can be hard, but hopefully there's a payoff. At the very least, we'll have a better understanding of each other. Mm-hmm. But another thing I would point out, and that is that if we reflect on those 3 hours, or however much time we spent talking about it, if we reflect on that, we can see that we didn't. There was some disagreement there, but it wasn't all disagreement. In fact, most of it was probably just us talking past each other. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that you can necessarily instantly fix. And it's not necessarily something that you even instantly notice. Sometimes it might take a while before we realize, wait a minute now, you actually, can you say that again in another way? Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too. And so we can, and so I think part of it is if you're trying to talk, and again, we're not necessarily experts here. You're practically listening to us in real time here, hacking our way through this. We're the, we got the machetes in the jungle of, of communication. We're hacking our way through here too. But what we're seeing here is that, it's very easy to be talking past each other because, maybe we all have our little bubbles that we're in, and to some extent we're all in our little bubbles. And so we might be used to hearing things a certain way. We might be used to saying things a certain way. We certainly might be used to thinking about things a different way, having one thing that I like to recommend to my students is that they, because I usually, especially like for my online classes, I'll make my own videos, but most of the textbook publishers now, the books that they sell comes with videos. And so I encourage the students to watch those other videos, because maybe they would, just hearing it from a different perspective, a different instructor is going to describe something in a slightly different way. And so, if they listen to me talk about something, that's fine. If we have a conversation about something, that's another thing. If they have a conversation with a student, that's another thing. If they have a conversation with a tutor, or, or other videos, or, YouTube or whatever, there's all these different perspectives. And so I think that's something that, even though we've been doing this for a little while, we still have to remind ourselves, okay, let's wait a minute. Let's find out how much of this is actual disagreement and how much of it is actually just us talking past each other.
This is coming from both you and I. I think that I've known you long enough that I know that you're that you're honest, intellectually honest. So this is, and I know my heart, of course. So this is coming from two people, Scott and I, who are both open to discussing things. And while we may seem entrenched in a certain way, maybe in that we're convinced of our beliefs. We are not opposed to hearing the other side. And so it becomes, that's an extra layer of difficulty when you tack on, when you're talking to somebody online or in any other, and you're already entrenched in your position and you're not interested in hearing anything from anybody else. So like this just shows sometimes how difficult communication can be, but I am actually excited that we were able to come to some kind of climax here with the, with this phrase and kind of have some kind of agreement on it.
Yeah, I think so. What is evidence? And this was actually, I was very surprised that you said, I gave a definition that I got off of a philosopher of science, and that was that evidence is something whose truth makes a particular conclusion more likely. And you didn't like that. Now that actually, I was quite surprised. So why don't you give a definition on what you think would constitute evidence?
Yeah, that's good. So, and I think that part of this disagreement comes in this idea that there's a difference between evidence for something and simply evidence. So, like if you consider, like in closing arguments, when you have in a courtroom, when you have a defense and or the prosecutor, and they're trying to make their final case, they're not using different evidence. They're using the same evidence, but what they will do is they will use different like subject matter experts, or they'll take in a different interpretation of the evidence. And so I think maybe the better the better definition for evidence is that evidence is something that could support a conclusion or could support a claim of truth. But because
I'm not sure I follow you there.
Well, I think the difference is, or my distinction is in that you could say that there's a piece of evidence that renders a conclusion more likely to be true than not. And I could say that same piece of evidence renders my conclusion more likely to be true than not. And so that's subjective. So I think a better understanding of evidence is just anything that can support a conclusion. Take, for instance, I don't know, you could take anything like the Big Bang cosmology. So there are some people who can take the same scientific facts and come to an absolutely naturalistic conclusion. And there are others that could take the absolute same evidence and come to a supernatural conclusion as far as the creator of, or the beginning, or originator, or whatever. And so I think the distinction is there's evidence, and then there's evidence for something. And I think that the evidence for something has a lot to do with how it's interpreted, and is very subjective, if that makes sense.
Well, when do you think the word evidence then would be used other than in an evidence for situation? Like when would you ever talk about evidence that's not evidence for a conclusion?
Well, I think I just listed, or just tried to show you how we could have evidence, but two different sides could come to two different conclusions looking at it. Right? So we could have right, that would be an evidence for situation. It's just that one side would say it's evidence for this, and the other side would say it's evidence for that. Mm-hmm.
Right, but what I'm asking is, so you made a distinction between evidence and evidence for something, and so what I'm asking is, would you ever use the word evidence outside, separate from an evidence for situation? Would you ever talk about evidence that's not evidence for a conclusion?
I might in terms of I'm talking with so and so, and so they're gonna bring forward their evidence.
Okay.
Or I'll bring forth my evidence, and so that particular evidence is neutral in that, or is generic in terms of evidence is just something that could be used to support a conclusion, but that particular evidence, because again, this is subjective. So you could say it's a fact that renders a conclusion more likely be true than not. Okay. So I disagree with, say you bring up a fact. Well, I think that this piece of evidence renders this more likely to be true than not. And I say, well, I don't think so. Does that mean that isn't evidence anymore? No.
Well, then we could just discuss evidence. The merits of the claim. We could discuss if I say that this supports, this particular piece of evidence renders this particular conclusion more likely. Mm-hmm. We could discuss whether or not it in fact is evidence, or to use your phrase, so evidence for that claim.
So mine is I don't know that we disagree on this either. Mine's just a two-pronged approach. So you have evidence, but then you have to evaluate that evidence and decide is it in favor for this or not. And so that would be like my approach.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I guess, to me, it seems like that there would be no usefulness in using just the evidence other than here, I'm about to make an argument kind of thing, kind of a situation. It seems like the only thing that would be interesting, because presumably we're talking about something and we want to find out whether or not a particular thing is true, or we're discussing whether some claim is true. And so, I mean, for me, in that situation, I'm only concerned about evidence that would support that claim. And if there's no evidence that supports that claim, then it's really irrelevant to the conversation.
But some people would still consider it evidence. So like maybe
but I don't care. I don't care if they consider it evidence. If it doesn't reflect on the conclusion we're talking about.
But that's subjective, though. That's why I'm saying that evidence in general is this generic idea that it's just anything you want to put forward that you think supports something, and then we get in then now that second prong is where we get into let's decide, let's try to make a decision if this is evidence that follows your premises to your conclusion. Is this valid? Is this good evidence?
Okay. Well, I think this is largely a semantic difference.
I think you're probably right.
You're talking about the difference between evidence for a conclusion and just evidence. And I would actually describe those as the first category is evidence, and the other category is just not evidence. It's just, okay.
Right,
you can,
but I
fine.
think I just gave you
your height. Right, but your height is an example.
Yeah,
sorry,
I gave you an example, though, of a time when I could submit something that I believe is a fact that renders a conclusion more likely to be true than not.
I agree. And so then we could talk. So then in your mind, we would, the discussion that we would have about that particular claim or that particular observation or fact or whatever, in your mind, you're looking at that as a discussion of, does this evidence favor this conclusion? And in my mind, we're having the exact same discussion, but the two prongs is evidence or not evidence. I'm
just giving allowing the distinction for, Your Honor, evidence exhibit A, right? Evidence exhibit B. And so you're seeing pieces of evidence being put forward, and one side thinks that is, that supports their conclusion. The other side doesn't. But just because the other side doesn't agree, it doesn't support their conclusion, doesn't mean exhibit A, exhibit B, doesn't mean that's not evidence anymore. So it is evidence. Everything's evidence. Okay, now let's determine if this does indeed support, your conclusion. So I think you're right. It's probably
I think we just have different usage, and I think as long as we're clear what we mean, I don't think we'll have a problem with that. But you did mention something there a couple of times now, the idea of judging whether or not evidence is good or not good is subjective. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that that's a subjective thing. And I guess what I would say to that is if you can't objectively show me how your evidence supports your claim, then I don't care about it. I don't think that's not a subjective thing. That's the whole idea of having the discussion, is to be able to demonstrate something. And so if it were just subjective, whether or not this evidence is good or not, then it's useless. That's useless. Because if it's all going to just boil down to somebody's subjective opinion, well, we already know, all of us have, bus loads of biases and mental shortcuts that our brains take and so on. And so, our subjective opinion to me, that's completely useless. There is no use in somebody telling me that I really think that this is strong evidence. Well, so what? Show me, right? So if you can't demonstrate, if you can't make a case that it's objectively supporting your conclusion, then, so what? You've told me nothing. Basically reiterated that you think your conclusion is true.
But you could have evidence. Well, I could still give you evidence. I could still give you, I could expound upon this particular piece of evidence supporting my conclusion, and you could still say, no, I don't think so. And so,
right. But then you could turn around and say, yeah, but I've demonstrated this particular thing. I've demonstrated that if you push this lever on this metal object, a bullet shoots out the other end. I've shown you that.
But we also have instances where you have evidence. You're looking at the same body of evidence, but two well-intending, very intelligent people come to two vastly different conclusions. And they both use that as evidence for their particular position.
Right. But what I'm saying is that if there's two people that are having that discussion, that disagreement on what they think the evidence implies, what's important is that they can demonstrate that the evidence does in fact support their conclusion. If one side can demonstrate it objectively, it doesn't matter if the other side agrees with that or not. If something's demonstrated, then it's demonstrated. If something is shown to be true, it doesn't matter what the other person thinks.
Yeah, and then that's going to depend too upon now. Are we talking about some kind of logical contradiction or some kind of mathematical thing? In which case, I could say, okay, because those are pretty hard truths that both you and I could agree on. But there are other things that you and I might disagree on, that you think you objectively showed this, and I didn't think you did. And so that's why we have to evaluate whether or not the evidence is good or bad, because you could think that you demonstrated it, and I could think you haven't. And so that's why you have juries that sit and they have to deliberate on the evidence, this one body of evidence that both prosecution and defense think supports their case or hopes supports their case. And so now the juror has to take that evidence and decide, okay, does this whole body of evidence or individual pieces, do they support, are they in favor of the prosecution or the defense? So I think that certain things might be objective in the sense that they're logically incoherent, or they're, they break some kind of, there's some kind of fallacy. But even then, if there's, just because it's fallacious doesn't mean it's not true. But you could have, logical inconsistencies. Like if something's a contradiction.
But there you're talking about an argument, right? A fallacy, a piece of evidence is not, that can't be fallacious.
So can you show me something that would be like, see, I'm trying to differentiate, I can't even say that. I'm trying to show the difference between, between you being able to objectively show me that something is true.
Right. Okay. So here's an example. Yeah. So let's say that I'm trying to prove that you were in my refrigerator. Not like that you raided my refrigerator, that you actually have been in my have it like moved stuff around and so on. And so as evidence, I show you a fingerprint in the butter. and you say, well, that doesn't mean I was there. That doesn't mean I did anything in your refrigerator.
Right.
But if I can demonstrate what fingerprints are, how fingerprints are left on things, what that, if I can show the inference there, we can look at your fingerprint and we can say, notice the loops and swirls or whatever, the characteristics of the fingerprint, and say, here's Jamie's fingerprint. Here's the fingerprint I found. If I can demonstrate if I can show that inferential link there, if I can show what's going on, then that would be you can still deny it. You can still deny it. That's fine.
I could say the police planted that. They took my thumbprint and they put it in the butter. Or I could say that you came to my house and you drugged me and with the butter stick and you stuck my finger in it. So I could that seems ridiculous. It seems absolutely ridiculous. But that's why we evaluate. Is this fingerprint?
But you're not talking about the veracity or the strength of the evidence there. You're talking about subterfuge. You're talking about misleading somebody else. We're talking about the honesty of the person who gathered the evidence, that kind of thing. If I could show you, if I have videotape of the police coming in and checking the refrigerator and finding, then that would strengthen that would strengthen your confidence in the evidence gathering process.
Right. So
which is where the drop would occur and so on.
Right. So, and you're right. I think that if my thumbprint was in the butter in your house, that would be pretty damning evidence. But to go so far as to say that that's objectively true, man, I don't know that can be done simply because there are other possible. I think you could say it's the best inference based on the evidence. I think you could say it's good evidence that it supports my conclusion. But other than it being outside of some kind of logical inconsistency or something incoherent, I don't know that you could say it's objectively true. Because there's always some other there's always some other spin that I could put on it that's a possibility. It's not probable, but I can always put in someone's mind. There's a possibility something else happened. Right, but wouldn't make that objective. It would just make that subjective at that point.
We can address that certainty. We can address that level of confidence, and that would be. That's not a subjective thing, because if it is subjective, if in fact the quality of evidence is a subjective judgment, how could you ever argue that I was wrong? If I say I don't believe that evidence supports your conclusion, there's nothing you can say. Right. If you do in fact, if it is a subjective opinion, then you could argue all you want, and I could just say, no, I don't know. I don't think it's makes your case.
Right. That's why we have a jury that makes those decisions. So it's just not
but the jury can't tell me that I'm subjectively wrong either.
Right. No, but that's what I'm saying. You have to evaluate that evidence. So you think that there are some I don't know.
We evaluate it by looking at the objective case. Now, I'm not saying that we can necessarily objectively prove with 100% certainty, but what we can do is we can show actual, facts about the universe that are true. We can demonstrate something. We can show, like I said, we could show you how fingerprints are gathered. We can show you how they're compared. We can show you data that tells us that people's fingerprints are different, or, we can show you all of this information, and that, the strength of, and again, there might be some, talking past each other a little bit here, but, the strength of the evidence is based on the strength of the case that can be made based on, and it's not based on the, yes, there is ultimately when we're trying to have a persuasive conversation, yes, there's going to be a moment where somebody has to say, I buy it or I don't buy it. Yeah, there is a subjective component to it, but I think when we're talking about the evidence, we're talking about one side's ability or lack of ability to make a strong objective case that this is what happens. This evidence is left under these circumstances, and so we can make this implication because this evidence is here. You know, you have to be able to, and so when we're talking about a jury, that's what the court case is for. The prosecutor tries to demonstrate these things. They try to show, okay, we got this gunshot residue on their hand, and here's how that's left, and here's what happens when you fire a gun. There's gases and particles and so on, and so all I'm trying to say is there isn't this Cartesian certainty. There isn't this absolutely. We've talked before. I'm not even certain I'm here right now, right? So I'm 99% certain that I'm here right now. So that's why I say there has to be an evaluation of this evidence. And so you could say that this is objectively true, but I don't know that it is in a Cartesian sense in terms of like, there's no other possibilities. This has to be it, and that's it. Because I don't know if there's even one of those other than maybe that I am. I think, therefore, I am. I don't know if there's anything other than that. Maybe mathematics and logic in terms of that. But like I said, I'm not talking about certainty here. I'm talking about inference. When you say that it's subjective, that means something. Ultimately, everything that you've ever seen and everything that you've ever known and everything that you've ever heard is subjective because it's in your brain. That's where you experience things, is in your brain. And so, to that extent, everything is subjective. Now, if we then go and call everything subjective, then we're not making a distinction here. There is a distinction between pure opinion and assessment of facts and of reality and of information that's presented. Okay? Neither of them are totally devoid of subjectivity. I'll agree. I'll give you that much. But I think if we say judging whether or not evidence is good is subjective, I think that's pushing it too far. I think.
Well, maybe I could say like this, and I don't know if you could agree with me on this. Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. Evidence doesn't say anything. The prosecution or the defense does. Meaning that evidence in and of itself is just that. It's just Exhibit A. When we begin to build that case or make those inferences, I think that because we're making those inferences, and because there is other possible explanations, and you can't have that certainty that's what makes it subjective. Is just like I would completely agree with you that there are certain things that when presented are way more probable than other things. But I don't know that it makes them objective.
So are you equating certainty or lack of are you equating certainty with objectivity and lack of certainty with subjectivity?
Maybe if I because I'm trying to work this through in my own mind now. So if I was, how would that be an error? Like, that's an honest question.
Well, because I think they're measuring two different things.
Okay.
Because subjectivity. If we're talking about, let's look at let's talk about broccoli. A lot of people in this world love broccoli. I can't stand broccoli. So when I describe broccoli, I say that's disgusting.
Right.
Okay. That's a subjective assessment of the broccoli because it's a property of the subject, of the speaker. Not necessarily. I mean, obviously, it's based on some properties of the broccoli, because you can't give me, a piece of chocolate and say it's broccoli, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is delicious. I love this. No, there are some physical properties there,
right.
but the assessment that it's disgusting clearly is just my opinion,
right?
Because I could hand it to my daughter and she loves broccoli and she'll eat it and she'll say this is delicious,
right?
Okay, that's a subject. Now we could say something like broccoli is green. Okay. Now now depending on how we define green, yes, color
standard,
is
standard. Yeah.
Color is interpreted in your brain, but we could also talk about color as a frequency of light reflected off of an object. And so we can, there are objective ways of measuring color. So in that case, we could say that this broccoli is green. So if I come along and I say, oh, it's red. Well, it might look red to me. Maybe there's something wired differently in my brain. Maybe I don't perceive green. Maybe I'm colorblind. Yeah. Maybe maybe I'm looking at it from a certain angle. There's different light on it, but it's still, that doesn't make it, red broccoli or something like that. Okay. And so I guess with respect to evidence, we want to make a case based off of things that can be demonstrated, things that can be objectively assessed. And
so if you take a fingerprint, like you were talking about, or in the butter or whatever, you could objectively show that that's a fingerprint. You could probably objectively show beyond a reasonable doubt that it's my fingerprint. But the inference that follows from that is subjective. That's my point, is that all of these, evidence doesn't say anything. We interpret the evidence certain ways.
Yeah, that would be an uncertain, I don't think that would be a subjective inference. Because a subjective inference would just be, well, I think fingerprints are caused by fingers, and somebody else says, I think fingerprints are caused by
the inference
strong
you're making,
wishes.
Though you're saying we're agreeing that objectively that there is a fingerprint, that it's in the butter, and that it's mine. The inference you're making, though, is that I was in your refrigerator,
right?
Working around or doing whatever. I don't think you could objectively show that. I think you could make a strong inference. I think I'd probably go to jail.
We're not talking about certainty here. I can show you that, fingerprints are produced this way, and in order for your fingerprint to get there, your finger must have been there. And, I can show that your fingers are still attached to your body. And so therefore, we can make a strong, objective, evidential case that you were there. Now,
I think you can. Now that's when you say objective. That's what gets me, because yes, you could show that how fingerprints are made and that it is my fingerprint. I'm not denying that it isn't. I've been rooting around in your fridge. I'm not denying that it wasn't my fingerprint, right? But so I get that you could objectively show those things,
right? So the strength of that,
but your inference is, though, that I was in your refrigerator. And what I'm saying, though, is I don't know that again, I don't think evidence can objectively say anything. I think that you could infer things from evidence, and you can, right? But that's why we see two people looking at the same evidence and coming up with different conclusions. The evidence might be, both people might think the evidence is amazingly strong, objectively strong. It objectively shows this. Well, obviously it doesn't, because this person says it objectively shows this too.
But we know that. So if our particular assessment of that is going to be subjective, that doesn't mean that the argument is based on subjectivity. It doesn't mean that the evidence itself is subjective. It doesn't even mean that the inference is subjective. It means that your assessment of the inference is subjective. So if you went to court and you said, no, fingerprints are not, I don't believe that shows, that I was there.
Okay.
Well, you'd be wrong, and that's fine, and that's your opinion, and you can have an opinion there, but the evidence shows otherwise.
But what if I was able to show
not necessarily with certainty,
right? What if I was able to make a strong case, that it was planted there, like it made it very believable. That would be strong. Would that be objectively true then?
You would need stronger evidence then that's based, you'd say, here's a video of somebody sneaking into my bedroom and stealing my thumbprint. And here's a video of that, or here's, 7 eyewitnesses that work at this lab where they create false fingers or something like that, or so you could, that the evidence, the assessment of the evidence is still objective, but it's just you have stronger evidence. And by the way, that would be a good example of using extraordinary evidence to make an extraordinary claim. If I'm claiming that your fingerprint proves that you were there, and if you claim no, that doesn't, so then that puts you in a position of making an extraordinary claim, and then in turn backing that up with extraordinary evidence. Oh, I have this amazing video, this perfect video of somebody sneaking into my room. It's just a
video, right? Don't add objectives to that. It's just a normal video.
It'd be unusual. You don't normal. I don't know about you, but I don't make a habit of recording people in my bedroom.
No,
right?
But
so by amazing, I don't mean wow, abracadabra kind of amazing. I mean, unexpected or unusual. That's not the type. You don't normally present that kind of evidence. It could also be amazing in the fact that it was a coincidence that somebody was recording this, or maybe there could be a lot of different approaches. But what I'm saying is that evidence is extraordinary because it's unusual. People who get busted having their fingerprints on things don't normally have a video in their back pocket of somebody planting.
Right.
And so you would back up your extraordinary claim that fingerprint is wrong with your extraordinary evidence. Hey, I have, even if people do that kind of thing, which I'm sure happens, people plant evidence, but usually when evidence is planted, usually it's not, you don't catch it on video. You don't have seven people working at the lab, backing it up. And so that's what I mean when I say unusual in that case. But again, I think as long as we're clear when we're speaking, I think this is largely not a difference of opinion on the concepts, but I think it's more of a difference of opinion on how we're expressing those concepts. And so I think as we're approaching things, we'll as long as we're careful, I think we'll be okay with that.
Yeah, I think that part of what it comes down to, again, and I hate to go back to my previous experiences, but what I might think is strong evidence, you might not, and vice versa. And so it's hard. It's hard for me to see how anything. And when you say like objective, and you're using that word, I'm assuming you were using like the traditional sense of the word in terms
meaning
of
a property of the object,
right? Or that it, yeah, right. But again, I think all of this we make inferences from evidence that evidence isn't like, you could have good evidence, good quality evidence, poor evidence. You could have a lot of evidence or very little evidence.
But that's argumentation. That's not the evidence itself. That's argument. That's the argument built up around the evidence. So
if you said the knife is made of this kind of metal and it's got this kind of handle, I think those probably could be, beyond a reasonable doubt, shown to be objectively true. But if you said that the blood that was on this knife came because Jamie stabbed someone with it, it's got Jamie's fingerprints on it, and it's got the other person's blood on the knife, I don't think that could be objectively shown, because, again, I could say, well, you could show that it is my fingerprint, probably objectively, and you could show that blood is someone else's. However, you're inferring now a conclusion.
But think about how you're constructing your argument there, though. You're not basing that argument off of your opinion. You're basing it off of these things that you can demonstrate. This particular metal burns this color, so if I take a scraping and burn it, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You're building a case. And when I say the evidence has to be objective, what I mean is that there has to be a demonstration that's not just a matter of the perspective or the perception of the person that you're talking to.
Okay, when I think of objective,
then it's just
right, and maybe that's where we're parting there, because when I think of objective, I'm thinking, hey, this is what follows from this, And no matter what you think about it, this is how it is. Right?
Well, there are things that, there are things that are true.
Mathematical things and
even outside of math.
Logical
there
things.
Are things that are true.
Right.
Well, even like there's a glass on my table here.
Sure.
There is truth to that fact. It's either true or it's false. And so, but we can have opinions on it. But what I'm saying is that the strength of the strength. So if we're talking about subjectivity, we're talking about somebody's perception of it, and it's not so much depending on the perception of something, it's what you can show to be true. I can hit it, the glass, I can dump out the juice that's in it, I can do various things. But again, I think if we tread carefully, I think that's not going to be a stumbling block for us.
All right. Sounds good to me.
There was one last thing that I wanted to talk about this, and this is the idea about the difference between direct and indirect evidence. And for one thing, right off the bat, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm not really concerned about direct versus indirect evidence. But I wanted to make sure we at least had because you were concerned that certain types of evidence were going to be discounted because of their nature.
Yeah. And I think I could probably clear all this up with this. I don't care what you call the evidence, direct, indirect, I don't care what you call it. As long as, and I know that you said you wouldn't do this just for the sake of podcast, so I'm going to bring this back up though. As long as we don't categorize evidence as good or bad, more valuable or less valuable based on those definitions. An example would be, all they have is just a circumstantial case. You hear that all the time in movies and things like that, when it turns out that's just a misnomer. That's just usually untrue. Actually, most cases are proved circumstantially. And so as long as certain evidence is not going to be, that's only indirect evidence. So as long as we're not going to categorize evidence as good or bad, or more or less valuable based upon that, I don't care what you call it.
Okay.
I think we got into a big back and forth about exactly what that was. And I'm okay. I'll use your definitions. I don't care. And I think that you had mentioned too, and I didn't think that you would, but you mentioned that you wouldn't, that's not, you're going to evaluate evidence as it comes.
Right.
And that you wouldn't throw out, something based on a category.
Right. I largely agree with you, and then I have one caveat. The agreement is that, right, I don't think it's fair to discard evidence or going into it to assume that evidence is inferior just because it's either direct or indirect. And by the way, the definition of, I know you had your definition of direct or indirect. I think it makes more sense to say that, direct evidence is evidence that doesn't require any kind of intermediate explanation. There doesn't need to be any kind of inference made to connect the evidence to the whatever you're trying to talk about. Like the example I gave with, if somebody if you see a body there with a knife in its chest, you can come to the conclusion that there's that person took a knife to the chest.
Right.
Okay. And there's direct evidence there. The knife is still sticking in the chest, and you don't have to jump through any hoops to come to that conclusion. Right. That they took a knife to the chest. There might be other things, if you wanted to show that a particular person put it there, that might require an inference. And so that particular piece of evidence would be direct for that one conclusion. It would be indirect maybe for a different conclusion. But the indirect evidence, and this I'm taking from from multiple sources that I looked up definitions of indirect evidence, is that there's an inference to be made in the middle there. For example, if I see somebody leaving the scene of a crime, that would be indirect evidence that they committed the crime. And because it puts them there, but I didn't actually see them do the crime. If I see them grab a purse and run off, then that's direct. Then my testimony is direct evidence. But if I just see them running down the street, then that we have to make an additional inferential leap there. We need to say, okay, well, there could be other reasons that they were running down the street. It's just not, it's not directly tied. There's that, there's that step in the middle that we're missing. And so I said, I'm going to largely agree with you and have one caveat. Again, the agreement was that I don't think we should be dismissing evidence simply because of the category it's in. However, indirect evidence does require, it will depend on the strength of that inference that can be made. And so if I can make a strong case that because I saw them running down the street, if I could prove that there were no other people in the vicinity, or if I could, match it up with some other evidence that maybe the person who had their property stolen said something else that connects them to the crime somehow. Okay, so if I can show a strong connection between the two, I saw him running away. There was nobody else there.
Can you give
makes
me
it,
an example
makes it stronger.
of something that would be direct evidence where you wouldn't have to make an inference?
Direct evidence where you wouldn't have to make an inference?
Yeah.
If I saw them do it, if I saw them grab the person, run away.
Okay, so if you saw somebody grab somebody and run away, that's
if I saw them grab a person, run off.
So to you, the only thing, now I'm putting words in your mouth here just so I could figure this out. So the only kind of evidence that is direct evidence where you don't have to make an inference is eyewitness testimony.
No, because the other example that I gave also is with the knife in the chest. If the knife is still in the chest, that's direct evidence that they took a knife to the chest.
Right, but you have to. But what are you inferring with the evidence? You know what I'm saying? Like the evidence.
Just what I said.
That somebody killed somebody, or
okay, so yeah.
What
so
is
that's
that
what
evidence
I said.
for, though? I mean, there's a knife in his chest, but I don't know that what's it evidence for? So we're making an inference then.
It would be direct evidence that the person took a knife to the chest, because there's no other inference needed. They have a knife in the chest. I suppose the assumption that they weren't born with a knife in the chest. Okay, but I don't think that's a big leap.
Right.
Okay, so it's direct evidence that they took a knife to the chest, but it would only be indirect evidence that Jamie stuck the knife in the person's chest. Okay, so because then in that case, the same piece of evidence becomes indirect because we're coming to a different conclusion now. The first conclusion was they took a knife to the chest. Direct evidence. We can see that they have a knife in the chest. Okay, but if I want to come to the conclusion that Jamie stabbed the person in the chest, then I need to make other connections there. There need to be other inferential connections there. Maybe I'd have to show that you were the only person in the room, or maybe I would show that, you got in an argument with them, or maybe I could show that it was your knife, or there's a variety of ways that I could add that connection in there. But what I'm saying is that, that's the difference. Okay. The difference between direct and indirect evidence is not how much they support the conclusion. It's that indirect evidence needs that little extra connection, which often can be very strong. In many cases, it's not hard to make that inferential connection. And that's when you get that very strong circumstantial evidence, especially if you have multiple avenues of evidence that kind of support each other. But I would say that, like, for one instance, I don't know that I disagree with that. I probably have to think on that more, but I think when you think of like direct evidence versus indirect evidence, if let's just take direct evidence as far as like eyewitness testimony, that I wouldn't say that is more valuable. I specifically said that
evidence. Right?
I specifically said that I'm not saying that one is more valuable than the other or stronger than the other. What I'm saying is that they can both be equally strong or equally weak. You can have weak direct evidence too, but they can both be equally strong or equally weak, but that indirect evidence has that one little extra piece that you need. That you have to have that.
I don't know that I don't know that I disagree with that. I mean, it's probably all verbiage here, but I mean, with mine, for our listeners, my definitions of direct and indirect come from J. Warner Wallace. He was a homicide cold case detective. Direct, just being eyewitness testimony. Indirect being everything else. And it was just those two neat little categories, and that's how they follow. So something could not be
very
direct
often,
and
very
indirect,
often, Yeah, very often that's the case too. And I mean, but
so a lot of times what you're seeing though is with your definitions, it's situational because something could be direct evidence, and that same piece of evidence could be indirect evidence given the situation,
depending on the claim being made. Right.
Right. Yeah. Whereas saying it the other way, it's either direct or indirect, and there's no haggling.
Right.
But again,
so using that other definition, I have to tell you that I think you're misinterpreting what Wallace was saying. Either that or Wallace was just wrong, because the document that you struck up a conversation with him and he gave you this document to this is how we decided, and based on that document, the example in that document was an example of it that they gave for indirect evidence was, and I can read, I have it right here. It's that if a witness testifies that he saw someone come inside wearing a raincoat covered with drops of water, that testimony is circumstantial evidence because it may support a conclusion that it was raining outside. And so there'd be that extra connection there. So I all due respect to Mr. Wallace, I think either he was getting it wrong or I think you were misunderstanding what he was saying, because the example that he gave shows that eyewitness testimony might be direct evidence and might not be direct evidence. It might be circumstantial evidence.
Regardless, I go back to, I don't care what you call it.
Right. Yeah.
Because
I think
again,
we need to do that.
I think a lot of my work, and I'm not going to lie, my this whole evidence business, I'm trying to set up a level playing ground when we talk about the resurrection, because too often, and obviously not with you, my other conversations with people is that they'll accept certain things to be true. And when I use the exact same criteria that they used in the case of, like, say, the resurrection, they just outright deny it. And I'll get kind of this juking and jiving of hard to pin them down on. Okay, well, if this is true, what would we expect there to be, and what kind of evidence would you want? And so it's difficult to have those dialogues when there isn't this level playing field. If I could show you that, for instance, a certain Caesar lived at a certain time using a certain criteria, and it's widely accepted in historical scholars are like, yeah, this is the criteria we use for this. I think the same criteria should be used when evaluating other claims, other historical claims. And so
for making the same type of claim. Yeah, I agree with that.
So that's all I'm saying, is that I'm just trying to see. So if you want to call direct, indirect, however we want to do it, however we want to say it, I'm totally fine with that. As long as when we get to the evidence, it's evaluated for what it is, the kind of evidence it is, the quality, and what we'd expect based on the criteria of either scientific criteria, if it's something science in the hard sciences, or historical criteria based on that. Whatever the case, I just want what's good for the goose. That's all I ask. Sure.
Yeah, I think we're okay there.
I think we came to more agreements in this particular pot than all the other ones combined.
You think so?
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe
does that mean we're getting weak, or does that mean we're getting strong?
Well, both. I don't know. Oh,
I have to think about that one. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I think, I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to say about this topic?
About extraordinary claims required? No, I think that you and I both kind of have come to an agreement. I think you and I both can agree that if something happens that's out of the ordinary, then whoever's making that claim had better bring some good evidence, both in quality and quantity. And that would be my generic definition of that. The extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
That was our twofer. That was our two discussions on extraordinary evidence, kind of mushed into one. It was extraordinary. I agree with you. But let's dive right into the next piece. Then we're going to spin the wheel.
Spin the wheel.
So let's do that. We'll spin the wheel.
Spin that wheel.
We're going to play a little game called Spin the Wheel. So we have
spin the
variety of
spin the wheel. Spin the
We're not
wheel.
talking about, a game you play as a preteen or a tween, with the, you get a bunch of your friends, you spin the bottle. We're not doing that. We're spinning. So we're going to have, so each of us have a handful of topics that we want to throw at the other person. And we're going to spin the wheel and pick one at random. And then the other person will have 2 minutes to answer without worry of being interrupted or anything. It's just a 2-minute one-sided discussion. So I think what we're going to do first is Jamie's going to spin the wheel and have a topic for me to answer, and then I have 2 minutes to answer it. Okay?
Right.
All right, so spin the wheel.
Here we go. Here it is.
Boom. I love that wheel. That's an awesome wheel.
I know. That's a great wheel. All right, here it is.
Okay.
All right. So, obviously on my wheel anyhow, I have some political things, some religious things, some non-religious things, some personal things, and this happened to fall on something kind of not like personal, but just in the personal category.
Okay.
If you
boxer briefs
could make
Oh, that wasn't the question. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Okay. Go ahead.
That was the question,
Boom.
Nostradamus.
Nailed it.
Man, I don't even want to go now. No. If you were tasked with creating, producing, directing a documentary about anything, what would it be and what would it look like?
Ooh, okay. What would it be? So should we start the timer?
Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So I got 2 minutes here. If I were to make a documentary about, I think the thing that fascinates me the most is I love to figure things out. I love to solve puzzles. I love to, that's maybe what attracted me to math. I'm interested in figuring things out. And so I just eat up, these nature documentaries and philosophy and psychology. I think the one thing that is most interesting and also most terrifying for me is human psychology. I would, if I wanted to make a documentary, I would want to dive in, and I'm sure you haven't seen any of this in my, behavior on, in talking to me. I want to figure out what makes people tick. I want to figure out why our brains work the way they do. I want to figure out what's going on. I want to understand. I have the very easily attainable goal of, I want to know everything. I want to know how everything works. And so if I had to do a documentary, it would be on how things work. But if I had to narrow it down to something somewhat reasonable, I would do it on human psychology. How does people's brains work? How do their personalities fit in? I like reading books by he was either I think it was a psychologist by the name of Oliver Sacks. He wrote some books about these weird things that have happened, like phantom limb syndrome. He'll interview somebody who lost their arm or something, and how that person, he'll figure out ways that they can relieve some of the pain in their phantom limb, or divided brain syndrome. It's where either through some kind of brain trauma or something. Oh shoot, I'm running out of time. Where they'll separate. Like if you have epilepsy, one of the treatments is they'll separate the hemispheres of your brain. And sometimes it's so I'm going over time here.
Go.
Sometimes what happens, very rare, but the two sides of the brain don't communicate, and so sometimes they even develop two separate personalities. And I know of at least one case where that happened, and one side of the brain was religious and the other side of the brain was atheist. You think you and I can't communicate?
Shut up.
Try having two of those in your head.
Shut up.
Yeah, no, I'm serious.
I don't know why when you were talking about the particular you were mentioning about how the brain and how you want to see how it. I don't know why I had in my mind the movie Silence of the Lambs with
Hannibal Lecter.
Hannibal Lecter eating the brain out or picking the brain out.
Yeah. With Ray Liotta.
That was good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, you ready?
Good one, buddy.
I got okay, I'll spin the wheel here. Spin the wheel. Okay, so here's your category. This category is what the f***. Oh, wait, are we gonna have we decided whether or not we're gonna allow that on the show?
Yeah, we'll probably keep it. We'll
bleep it. Okay, we'll beep it. So what everyone knows what I'm saying.
Right.
We have to do an episode on swearing at some point. I think it's just the most ridiculous thing in the world. But anyway, so what the f***. Right. We'll bleep it again. I'll say it again. What the f***. Right. Okay. So here's your topic, okay? Exorcism. What the f***? That's it. You ready?
All right. Start that timer.
Do it up.
Exorcism. So, as a Christian, we believe that there are two aspects that we know of. The material world and the supernatural world. So, what we see in exorcism is just the evil aspect of the supernatural being invoked or in a human being. Now, obviously the Catholic Church is probably the best. In they have several hundred years, if not 1,000 years worth of doing these kind of things, and there are some very real cases of people who have been possessed by demons, by demonic forces, and they have been exorcised, and that's what exorcism is. Is that not what you were hoping for?
No, you still got time if you want to. I mean, so let me throw another question in there. So, does your church do exorcisms?
No, as far as, here's, first of all, this should be known that demonic possession is very rare. Okay. Most of the time in the past that people have said, oh, that person's possessed, it was usually some kind of mental problem or psychiatric issue, undiagnosed. And so, even today, most of what people would say, oh, that guy is possessed or whatever, most of that is a mental issue, psychiatric or psychological in nature. So they're very rare. So we don't do them at our church because they don't happen very often. But if someone were to come into our church and cause a ruckus, then we would do an exorcism.
Really? Okay.
Now, here's the thing. The exorcism as a Protestant is different than a Catholic. The Catholic has, there's a lot of things that are going on. There's a lot of different symbolism and things like that. As a Protestant, it is pretty basic in terms of what we believe can cast out the demon, and that's just invoking the name of Jesus, praying for that person. So that, it's not like we'd have to take him to the back room and get all our sacraments and things like that. We would just pray for them there. But all right, that's exorcism.
Awesome.
What say you about exorcism? I mean, do you think it's just those are either the Catholic Church behaving badly or other people just behaving badly in terms of having mental and psychiatric issues?
I don't know. Are we violating the core beliefs of the spin the wheel process? Am I allowed to comment here? I suppose if you ask me,
yeah,
I suppose that would be okay.
Yeah, we'll decide. We'll decide later if we should include this.
I think it's all hooey. I don't think demonic possession. I think that's a pretty far stretch to me. I think it's those like for state fairs and stuff, they have the chickens that can play tic-tac-toe and stuff, and they've done experiments on chicken. And let me know if I'm talking too long, because this was really your topic. They've done experiments on chicken or birds where they can kind of induce them into doing these ritualistic things by giving them food at random, and the birds think, even if they're giving them food at random, the birds think, I just flapped my wing and the food came out. That must make the food come out. And so they flap their wing, and they can develop these elaborate little ritual dances that they think they're making the food come out. And that's what I think is going on. I think it's just, trained chickens with random food pretty much. But, I'm right. Open to be convinced otherwise.
Right. I mean, well, it would be difficult in your position. Obviously, you're a naturalist, so this is a supernatural thing, or it's a mental, psychiatric issue. You know what I'm saying? So,
right.
Obviously, as a naturalist, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, it's demon possession, right? So,
right.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Hey, those were good.
Yeah. Excellent. Awesome. I'm glad I got that one. I thought that one. I threw that one as a fun one.
Yeah, that was pretty fun. If you want to call Exorcism and demon possession fun, we did have some fun.
I honestly didn't know how you were going to respond to it. I was expecting anywhere from you laughing at it to you saying, "Oh yeah, I performed an exorcism yesterday," and I was expecting anything in between. I had no idea. Yeah. So it's good. So it was fun.
What did you get? You just got the in between. Yeah.
Yeah. We just obviously was well, you were kind of maybe just past 50% kind of towards the, you obviously thought there was something to it, but
yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I think that they do occur, but I think that there's so few legitimate, because I mean, even my congregants will tell anybody that I always look for the natural first before I assume the supernatural. So I'm not one of those Christians that, like somebody comes in not feeling well, all of a sudden they're kind of spiritually oppressed. And they might be, but it's probably they're dehydrated, or something of that nature. So, I don't necessarily in these kind of things look directly to the spiritual. Let's take care of the physical. Let's take care of the mental.
There's hope for you yet, young Padawan.
And then when we ruled those out, for the most part, okay, now let's see, there might be a spiritual component to it, because it's just more likely that they're dehydrated, or that, if they're not feeling well, or they're sick, or something else.
Right. Yeah, I'd buy that too.
So, yeah.
All right. So good one there.
Very good.
Yeah. So it's a great spin the wheel, and I don't know. So that, I guess we can wrap it up then, huh?
Yeah.
And that about wraps it up for episode number 5. Please send us your ideas, questions, and comments to email at godornotpodcast.com. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered in this episode, Jamie recommends...
I recommend Forensic Faith by J. Warner Wallace, although the main point of the book is basically pointed towards Christians, saying, hey, listen, this is why we need apologetics. This is why you need to make a case evidentially for the Christian worldview. In the book, there's a lot of things that talk about evidence, burden of proof, and all different kind of things surrounding extraordinary claims, extraordinary evidence, things like that. So, Forensic Faith by J. Warner Wallace. What do you have, Scott?
Well, I recommend a book that has become a classic in the scientific skepticism community, and that is Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World. I thought that would be appropriate since we kind of began our discussion today on Carl Sagan. But The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. And in that book, Sagan basically lays out his approach to judging the difference between pseudoscience and actual science, between myth and reality. He talks about his baloney detection kit in this book, and it's just, like I said, it's just a classic. Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope you'll be back with us next time when Jamie and I will be talking about faith. Until then, this is your dialectic duo, reminding you to talk to each other.
See you later.
This has been the God or Not podcast. Send your questions or comments to email at godornotpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the show or grab some God or Not gear, please visit the website at www.godornotpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.